It was supposed to be a normal high school track meet as students from across the Frisco Independent School District gathered at Kuykendall Stadium. Athletes prepared to compete. Parents filled the stands. Coaches moved between events. And because of the passing of the rain shower, students crowded beneath tents seeking shelter. It would have been an ordinary spring afternoon. Instead, it became a scene of one of the most talked about criminal cases in America. A 17-year-old was dead. Another 17-year-old was under arrest. And within minutes, cell phone videos, police body cameras, and witness statements would transform a brief confrontation into a national debate. The victim was Austin Metcalf, a respected student athlete, a twin brother, a young man with his entire future ahead of him. The defendant was Karmelo Anthony, another student, another teenager, and according to prosecutors, the person responsible for Austin's death. For the entire encounter lasted only moments. A disagreement, a confrontation, a knife, and one fatal wound to the chest. The defense would argue self-defense. The prosecution would argue murder. And a jury would ultimately decide which version of the events they believed. Tonight's case shocked an entire nation, but like every crime, there was a reason. Welcome to the Voice of Reason. Who was Austin Metcalf? Before he became the victim in a nationally known criminal case, Austin Metcalf was a teenager. 17-year-old, a student at Memorial High School in Frisco, Texas. Friends, family members, and coaches described him as a dedicated athlete, respected, and a wonderful student. He competed in varsity athletics. He had goals. He had plans. He had dreams. And perhaps most importantly, he shared a unique bond with his twin brother, Hunter. Throughout the trial, Austin's family would become a visible presence in the courtroom. For them, the case wasn't about legal theories. It wasn't about jury instructions. It wasn't about criminal statutes. It was about a son, a brother, a life that ended too soon. Because on April 2nd, 2025, Austin arrived at Kuykendall Stadium, expecting to participate in a school track meet. He would never leave there alive. The person accused of killing Austin Metcalf was another teenager, Karmelo Anthony, 17 years old at the time of the incident, a student at Centennial High School. Like Austin, he was attending the district track meet that day. Under Texas law, 17-year-olds are prosecuted as adults. As a result, Anthony would face the criminal justice system as an adult, despite still being a high school student when the incident occurred. One of the most important facts presented by the defense was Anthony's lack of significant criminal history. Defense attorneys emphasized that he had no publicly known record of violent offenses, no history suggesting he was predisposed towards violence, no pattern of criminal behavior, the fact that would become important later, because the defense wanted jurors to see Anthony not as a violent aggressor, but as a teenager who found himself in a rapidly escalating confrontation, a confrontation they argued he did not even start. The day began like hundreds of other school athletic events. Students arrived early, teams organized equipment, coaches reviewed schedules, parents found seats in stands. The weather had changed, though, and rain moved through the area. Because of these, athletes and spectators looked for shelter. Students from multiple schools gathered beneath tents around the stadium. What happened next would become the central issue of the entire trial. Because according to testimony presented to the court, Karmelo Anthony entered the Memorial High School tent area. Austin Metcalf noticed him, and according to multiple accounts, Austin told Anthony that he didn't belong there. So at first, it was simply a verbal exchange, an argument, a disagreement between two teenagers. Nothing more, or so it seemed. But within moments, the situation began moving towards violence, and no one present realized that they were witnessing the beginning of a homicide investigation. As tensions increased, words were exchanged. Witnesses would later testify that Anthony warned Austin not to touch him. What happened next became one of the most disputed aspects of the case. The defense argued that Austin physically confronted Anthony. The contact mattered because it became the foundation of the self-defense argument that would later be presented to the jury. Now, the prosecution viewed the situation differently. Their position was that whatever physical contact occurred did not justify deadly force. And that's where the knife enters the story. Now, according to witnesses, Anthony produced a folding knife during the confrontation. The blade was reportedly about 5 inches long. The argument had now escalated beyond words, beyond pushing, beyond schoolyard conflict. Now there was a weapon, and within seconds, one teenager would be fighting for his life. The next moments would become the most important seconds in the entire case. Everything happened fast, too fast. One moment there was an argument beneath a team tent. The next moment a knife had been drawn. According to witness testimony, the confrontation escalated rapidly after a verbal dispute between Austin Metcalf and Karmelo Anthony. Students nearby later described the encounter as brief, chaotic, unexpected. There was no prolonged fight. There was no extended struggle. No opportunity for teachers, coaches, or other students to intervene. Then came the stabbing, a single strike, one wound, one decision. According to prosecutors, Anthony used a folding knife with a blade measuring approximately 5 inches in length. The knife entered Austin's chest. Within seconds, what had become a dispute over tent space had become a medical emergency. Witnesses later testified that the entire confrontation unfolded so quickly that many students initially struggled to understand what was happening. Then they saw Austin collapse, and suddenly everybody understood something terrible had occurred. As Austin fell to the ground, panic spread across the stadium. Students screamed. Coaches rushed towards the scene. Emergency personnel already assigned to the athletic event responded immediately, but the injury was catastrophic. Austin had suffered a stab wound to the chest. Medical personnel began life-saving measures. Every second mattered. Every minute mattered. Witnesses described confusion and disbelief. The track meets are supposed to involve races, competition, school pride. Not homicide investigations, not emergency trauma care, and certainly not a 17-year-old fighting for his life in front of a classmates. Despite the efforts of emergency responders, Austin's condition rapidly deteriorated. He was transported for medical treatment, but the injury proved fatal. Before the day was over, Austin Metcalf would be pronounced dead. A family had lost a son. A twin brother had lost his other half, and the state of Texas had a homicide investigation. And now Hunter was witnessing something no sibling should have to endure. According to trial testimony, Hunter described the confrontation, the stabbing, and the immediate aftermath. He also described efforts to help Austin after he was injured. For jurors, Hunter's testimony provided more than facts. It provided human context, because criminal trials often become consumed by evidence, exhibits, legal arguments, technical procedures. Hunter reminded everyone that behind every exhibit was a person, a real victim, a real family, and a loss that would never be repaired. His testimony became one of the most memorable portions of the trial, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deeply personal. Now, while emergency workers or emergency personnel worked to save Austin, law enforcement officers focused on searching the scene. Witnesses were identified, evidence was collected, and officers quickly located Karmelo Anthony. What happened next would become an important piece of evidence at the trial. According to reporters and testimony, officer body cameras recorded Anthony after he was detained. These recordings captured statements that prosecutors would later present to the jury. Among the statements reportedly heard on body camera footage were, "I did it," and "he put his hands on me." Now, according to prosecutors, those statements amounted to an immediate acknowledgement of what had occurred. The defense viewed them differently. They argued the statements supported the idea that Anthony reacted after being physically confronted. Regardless of the interpretation, the recordings became a significant part of the state's case because, unlike witness testimony, body camera footage allows jurors to observe events directly, to hear the defendant's own words, and to make their own judgment. As investigators processed Kuykendall Stadium, they gathered a wide range of evidence. This wasn't a secluded crime scene. It wasn't an isolated location. It was a public school athletic event with students, coaches, and spectators. That means investigators had access to something many homicide cases lack: witnesses, and a lot of them. The evidence collected were the folding knife, blood evidence, surveillance recordings, cell phone videos, body camera footage, medical records, witness statements. The volume of available evidence gave prosecutors confidence, but it also created challenges because multiple witnesses often remember events differently, especially during the moment of extreme stress. The investigators would eventually focus on the critical legal questions. Did the circumstances justify deadly force? Or did they constitute murder? That question would define everything that followed. When the autopsy was completed, the findings confirmed what emergency responders had already suspected. Austin Metcalf died from a single stab wound to the chest. The wound penetrated the chest cavity, and despite medical intervention, the injury proved fatal. The medical examiner classified the manner of death as a homicide. As always, the classification carried a specific meaning. It meant death at the hands of another person. It did not determine criminal guilt. That decision belonged to the courts. Still, the autopsy findings were important because they established the cause of death. They established the mechanism of injury. And they established that a single stab wound had ended a young man's life. For prosecutors, those findings supported a murder charge. For the defense, they did not dispute the injury itself. Instead, they focused on the circumstances that led to it, because everyone agreed on one thing: Karmelo Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf. As the murder investigation progressed, prosecutors reached a conclusion. This was not an accident. This was not a justified use of force, and this was not self-defense. According to the state of Texas, Karmelo Anthony committed murder when he stabbed Austin Metcalf during the confrontation at the stadium. The charge carried enormous consequences because under Texas law, a murder conviction could result in a sentence ranging from a few years to life behind bars. And for Anthony and his family, the reality was devastating. One moment, he had been attending a track meet. The next, he was facing the possibility of spending much of his life in prison. As the case moved towards trial, both sides began preparing for what everyone knew would become the central issue: self-defense. Everything would revolve around that claim. The prosecution's theory was straightforward, simple, direct. and powerful. According to prosecutors, Karmelo Anthony brought a knife to the event. Austin Metcalf was unarmed. Whatever physical contact occurred did not justify deadly force, and the stabbing constituted murder. The state relied heavily on the several pieces of evidence. First, there were eyewitnesses, students who described the confrontation and testified that Anthony produced the knife during the dispute. Second, there was video evidence. Surveillance footage and cell phone recordings captured portions of the incident and its aftermath. Third, there were Anthony's own statements. Body camera recordings captured him acknowledging involvement and referencing physical contact from the victim. And finally, prosecutors pointed to the physical evidence itself: a single stab wound to the chest, a wound severe enough to end a 17-year-old's life. When viewed together, prosecutors argued the evidence painted a clear picture: a confrontation, an escalation, a knife, and an unjustified killing. Defense attorney Mike Howard presented a very different story. The defense did not dispute that Austin Metcalf died. Instead, they challenged the interpretation of the event. According to the defense, Austin initiated the physical confrontation. Anthony warned him not to touch him. The physical contact occurred. From the defense perspective, the critical question became, what was Anthony thinking in that moment? Did he reasonably fear imminent bodily harm? The defense argued that he did. They pointed to several factors. Anthony was physically smaller. The confrontation escalated quickly. Physical contact occurred. Events unfolded within seconds. According to the defense, the encounter was chaotic, fast-moving, and frightening. The jury, they argued, needed to evaluate the situation through Anthony's eyes at the moment. Force was used, not through the benefit of his hindsight. As the trial unfolded, jurors heard from numerous witnesses. Many were students who had been present during the confrontation. Their testimony helped establish a timeline: the argument, the physical interaction, and the stabbing itself. Hunter Metcalf's testimony remained among the most emotional moments of the trial. As Austin's twin brother, he provided jurors with a first-hand account of the aftermath and the desperate attempts to save Austin's life. The defense also called coaches and character witnesses. Their purpose was not to dispute that Austin died. Instead, they attempted to show that Anthony was not naturally aggressive and had no reputation for violence. Character evidence alone cannot determine guilt or innocence, but it can influence how jurors evaluate a defendant's actions, particularly when intent becomes a central issue. And in this case, intent mattered a great deal. One of the most discussed discussions of the trial involves something that never happened. Karmelo Anthony never testified. Legally, that was his right. Every defendant has the constitutional right to remain silent. Jurors are instructed not to hold that decision against the accused, yet the decision still attracted attention because self-defense cases often involve a person's perspective, fear, judgment, and split-second decision-making. Those experiences exist inside the defendant's mind. By choosing not to testify, Anthony never personally explained what he saw, what he feared, or what he believed was about to happen. The defense relied instead on witness testimony, evidence, and legal arguments to establish the self-defense claim. Whether that strategy helped or hurt the defense would become one of the biggest questions surrounding the trial. Now, before the trial even began, another controversy emerged: jury selection. After voir dire concluded, no black jurors ultimately served on the panel. Defense attorney raised concerns regarding the composition of the jury. The issue quickly became part of the public discussion surrounding the case. For some observers, it raised broader questions about representation within the justice system. For others, it had little bearing on the evidence itself. The court allowed the trial to proceed, and ultimately, the jury that was selected would decide Anthony's fate. Not public opinion, not media coverage, not social media. 12 jurors, one verdict, and one question that would determine everything. Did Karmelo Anthony reasonably believe deadly force was necessary? Or did the evidence prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt? The answer was now in the hands of the jury. By the time the closing arguments began, jurors had spent days listening to testimony, students, coaches, police officers, medical experts, investigators. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. Now the attorney had one final opportunity to explain what those pieces meant. The prosecution's message was direct. Austin Metcalf was unarmed. The confrontation did not justify deadly force. And Karmelo Anthony's decision to use a knife transformed a teenage argument into a homicide. The defense asked the jurors to view the event through a different lens. A rapidly escalating confrontation, a teenager facing physical contact, a moment of fear, a split-second decision, and according to defense attorney Mike Howard, Anthony acted in self-defense. The jury now faced a difficult task, not determining whether the outcome was tragic. Everyone agreed that it was. Their responsibility was to determine whether the law justified Anthony's actions. Now, as the case neared deliberation, Judge John Roach gave jurors another option. They could consider manslaughter as opposed to murder. The decision was significant because it gave jurors a middle ground. If they believed Anthony acted recklessly, but without the legal elements required for murder, they could choose the lesser offense. The extent of the option would later become important, because when jurors reached their decision, they bypassed manslaughter entirely. Instead, they selected the most serious charge before them, murder. And on June 9th, 2026, after hearing the evidence and deliberating, the jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense. Austin Metcalf's family was present. Karmelo Anthony's family was present. Both sides understood that the next few moments would shape the future of everyone involved. Then the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of murder. For the Metcalf family, the verdict represented justice for a son who never returned home. For Anthony and his supporters, it marked the collapse of the self-defense claim that had formed the foundation of the defense's case. The jury had heard the argument, considered the evidence, and rejected the assertion that the stabbing was legally justified. A guilty verdict does more than establish criminal responsibility. It also tells us what jurors were not persuaded by. The defense argued Anthony feared imminent harm. Physical contact initiated the confrontation. The stabbing was self-defense. The jury rejected that argument, not necessarily because they believed every prosecution witness, not because they agreed with every prosecution theory, but because they concluded the evidence did not support legal self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction matters. The verdict was not simply a statement about what happened. It was a statement about what the law allowed. And according to the jury, the law did not justify the stabbing. Now, although the verdict resolved the question of guilt, another major decision remained: punishment. At the time the verdict was announced, sentencing had not yet been completed. Under Texas law, Anthony faces a substantial prison sentence for murder. The punishment range extends from multiple years in prison to life. His mother reportedly asked jurors for mercies during the punishment phase, describing her son as remorseful and asking them not to define him solely by the worst day of his life. The final sentence will determine how many years Anthony spends behind bars. But regardless of the number, the consequences of April 2nd, 2025 will last much longer than any prison term. Hours later, the judge had ruled, and on Tuesday, June 9th, Karmelo Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison. This case began with an argument between two teenagers. No long-standing feud, no elaborate plan, no history between them, just a brief confrontation at a high school track meet. Within moments, one teenager was dead, another was facing a murder charge, and two families would be changed forever. The jury ultimately answered the legal question. They concluded that the stabbing was murder, not self-defense. But beyond the courtroom, the tragedy remains the same. Austin Metcalf lost his life. Karmelo Anthony lost his future, and two families will forever be connected by a few seconds that neither can ever take back. And after everything investigators uncovered, one thing remains painfully clear. Every crime has a reason. You guys, this story was absolutely terrible. There were a couple of different things that I was thinking about, when researching this. I understand that it is not supposed to be held against a person if they choose not to testify. They have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and I understand that. But this is one of those incidents in which I believe that the jury needs to understand how you feel. The jury needs to understand what you were going through. The jury needs to understand your mindset. You needed to give them a walkthrough of your fear. You needed to give them an understanding of what you were going through. You needed to paint a picture. And I think, quite frankly, that would have probably been the only thing that could emotionally combat the testimony given by Hunter Metcalf. I mean, and I'm not for Karmelo Anthony. These are just my thoughts. If I was the defense, I would have probably said this is something that you probably need to do because, quite frankly, the cards are stacked against you. This self-defense doesn't look like it's working, and the only way a self-defense claim can work is if you help the jury understand why you felt you need to use deadly force in a situation like that. And the only way that you or they could find out how you felt at the time is not going to be able to come from other people. It's going to have to come from you. And those are my thoughts. You guys, I truly appreciate you. Thank you for hanging out with me this evening. This is the Voice of Reason. I am Reason. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I put out a new case every single week. I appreciate you listening to the reason behind these cases, because when it's all said and done, again, every crime has a reason. I appreciate you guys. Have a good night. See you next week.